So we're going to move forward to a second part of this entire session. When you're faced with cultural differences that can make or break your communication, how do you handle a situation like this? Today, we are going to learn how to navigate the complexities of the global marketplace and foster innovation and growth with the founder of Cultural Pathway. Please, everyone, put your hands together for Daniela Drageulis!
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, that Macarena brought me back a few years. Lots of really great memories. So when I first came to Pakistan, one of my first trips was up to Hunza. And I was invited to somebody's house because we all know that Pakistan hospitality is second to none. And at the end of dinner, before heading back to my hotel room, I asked the hostess if I could use the restroom. And she politely invited me to the upstairs, and she showed me a well-appointed room with a mattress on the floor, and she said, "Take all the time you need." And that's when I realized that something got lost in translation. I said, no. Can I use the washroom? And she said, "Oh, would you like Indian washroom or Western washroom?" And that just goes to show you that miscommunication can happen or misunderstandings can happen even when we speak the same language. Because we all live in an interconnected world. Today, more than ever, we cross borders on a daily basis. Physical products cross borders, and people too. We work with multicultural teams, virtual teams. How many of you work with multicultural teams or have encountered working with multicultural teams virtually, right? Headquarters, maybe, if you work with multinationals, right? So being culturally aware is a necessity, is vital to be a successful leader in today's world. But what does it mean to be culturally aware? What is culture? There's visible parts of culture, right? There's art, music, how we dress, the food that we eat. But there's also invisible parts of culture. There's that part, below the iceberg. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with, the iceberg or, the tree analogies. There's those beliefs, those norms, those cultural values that drive behavior and that are important to understand when we work with people who are different than us. Because culture matters when we work with people who are different than us, who are from different cultures. Because culture determines how we organize our families, our organizations. It matters because it impacts how we solve problems or conflicts, how we communicate with each other, impacts our relationships. It really impacts our feelings. What we decide that is acceptable in one culture might not be acceptable in another culture. Whether we look at each other in the eyes when we're speaking, it might be respectful in one culture, but might be considered disrespectful in another culture. Whether burping after a meal is respectful in one culture or disrespectful in another culture. Etc. So it really, especially when we work in organizations that are multicultural or we work with people from other cultures, is really important to understand those behaviors and what drives those behaviors, because when we make choices and decisions based on our culture, but people will evaluate our actions and our behaviors, that visible part of culture, based on their own culture, right? They see us through their own lens. So okay, I have to point that way. So that's what we call the cultural value orientations, right? And these are the overarching patterns of behavior that are shared by different cultural groups. And they're not meant to be stereotypes. These are just shared patterns that are of behavior that are passed on from one generation to another. They're taught to us by our schools, by our educators, and are really meant to help us decode some of those behaviors, some of the decision-making that happens when we work with people who are different than us. Understanding also that there's variations within the different groups. So when I share some of these cultural values next, please keep in mind that we're all individuals, and there are variations within those groups. And there's no right or wrong, right? These are not meant to be evaluative. So when we look at Pakistan, for example, right, we know that Islamic laws and Islamic traditions really rule, Pakistan cultural values, right? So it's highly collectivistic. It's highly hierarchical structure, right? When we look at some of the cultural values that rule specifically in the work environment, with strong family and community ties, collectivistic, right? With strong group cohesion and consensus decision making, indirect form of communication, and centralized decision making. In terms of conflict resolution, tends to be rather avoiding, confrontation. It's all about saving face, right? Approach to time is rather fluid. It's called, what we call polychronic approach to time, etc. So what happens when, we heard before some of the panelists were saying, that we are hardwired to feel more comfortable with people that act and look like us, right? It's natural because we talked about cultural values are passed on from generation to generation, right? And by educators. So obviously we will feel more comfortable working with people that look, that share the same values. But in this global interconnected world, reality is different, right? So what happens when we go out to, work with people who are different than us? So understanding those cultural values help us, like I said, decode some of those behaviors and those actions that happen, and understand that sometimes when we're interacting with people who are different than us, some of those actions that we might interpret as personal may be rooted in actual, cultural differences. So if sometimes we have an interaction or a conflict with somebody that is coming from a different culture, we might think, that person was rude. Well, maybe they were not rude. Maybe they're coming from a culture that is more direct in its communication style, or is used to a more confrontational style of conflict resolution, while we are coming from a culture that tends to avoid confrontation, right? Or if we're in a situation where, the person barges into the office to talk to the boss, and we are not used to that because we come from a more hierarchical society, well, maybe they're coming from a more egalitarian type of society. So again, understanding these, there is no right or wrong, it's just understanding that those cultural values might be, in some cases, the driver of those behaviors. Now, personality also sometimes overlaps. And for those of you who are working with multinationals, company culture also sometimes overlaps. So sometimes it tends to get a little bit complicated. But this just sort of highlights how complicated sometimes culture gets in understanding how to operate in multicultural environments. But this is where cultural intelligence can help you. And cultural intelligence is a capability that allows you to understand how to function and relate effectively in multicultural environments. And as a capability, it can be measured, and it is malleable and can be developed and improved over time. So it really recognizes that different people have different ways of thinking and behaving in multicultural environments. And it was developed in 1975, over 20 years of research and 150 countries with over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles and studies. So just like IQ and EQ, some of the panelists again mentioned earlier, IQ measures intelligence, EQ measures your ability to control your emotions, CQ, cultural intelligence, allows you to measure your ability to function more effectively in another culture. So it gives you those skills that you need to really understand what is happening, reflect on what is happening in that particular situation, and adapt or adjust your behavior in that multicultural environment. And there are 4 key pillars for cultural intelligence. One is what's called CQ drive, which is the motivational component. It's how you feel when you encounter a situation that is different than yours. So when you see a person with high CQ drive, is that person that walks into a room and it feels really comfortable talking to people who are different than him or her, right, from different countries, speaking different languages, is how comfortable, how resilient you are in a new environment. CQ knowledge is really understanding how cultures are different or similar than others. And this is usually the easiest one to acquire, especially in this day and age when there's so many documentaries, movies, social media, books, etc., right? And this is where also a lot of the mistakes happen, is knowing that you don't advertise bacon-flavored Pringles during Ramadan in a majority Muslim neighborhood in London, which has happened, by the way. So it's the cognitive, component of CQ cultural intelligence. CQ strategy is the metacognitive component, is how to plan ahead of an intercultural and multicultural encounter, and then reflect and adjust that behavior. And CQ action is putting it all together and then adjusting your direct or indirect communication, your gesture, your tone, the speed of your voice, etc. So we all know that there's certain qualities that a successful global leader needs, certain skills, personal skills, but really cultural intelligence needs is what brings it all together in order to be a successful global leader in today's multicultural environment. However, women specifically today face specific challenges, right? In terms of gender stereotypes and biases, hierarchical structures that could be different from country to country, work-life balance expectations as well, where you might be moving to a country where you might not have the support that you have in your home country. Personal safety concerns, dress code expectations might be different if you go to another country, even if it's for a business trip, where you might encounter situations where you might be feeling uncomfortable or inauthentic. So this is where cultural intelligence might be able to help you. So my advice to you, like I said, cultural intelligence is malleable. It can be developed over time. It is not easy, but there's certain things that you can do, and it's like driving a car. In the beginning, you have to learn the rules. It might take some effort, but over time, the more you do it, the more you practice, it gets easier and more natural. The first thing that you can do is do an assessment. There are assessments out there, just like personality tests and EQ tests. And then other things that you can do is get out of your comfort zone. Interact with people who are different than you. Get educated to acquire that knowledge that you need. Challenge stereotypes, not only other people's stereotypes, but your own. As you encounter people who are different than yours, try to reflect and see how you feel about that interaction with other people. Practice empathy, those listening skills, and observe those nonverbal cues. There's a reason why God gave us 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. Listen, observe, and speak less. Practice that mind shift, cultural dexterity, adjusting your behavior, your communication style, depending on the culture that you encounter. And seek feedback. Somebody else, mentioned during the panel also. If you're going to do a presentation, if you're going to interact with people from a different culture, seek feedback from a person that is in that local culture. Before you do a presentation, have that person double check, hey, make sure that your tone is right, the speed of your voice is right, the vocabulary that you're using is the right one for that environment. And again, foster an inclusive environment in your organization and also promotes creativity within your team. So overall, CQ is a great tool to allow you, again, to be a better leader in today's global, multicultural, multinational environment. If you have any more questions about any of this or you're interested in any of the assessments, you can connect with me via LinkedIn, or you can see me after the workshop.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this, and thank you for being part of the Macarena. That was actually a very fun experience for me as well.
It was really good.
So please do stay on the stage. I would like to call Shiri Nakwi to come on the stage to hand over a memento for you. And thank you for being part of Wibcon. I think the more interesting stories we have coming into Wibcon, one of the things that makes this conference very different from others is the amount of learning that's put into this conference. We walk away transformed. We've got 3 amazing rising stories coming up, and they're all rapid-fire sessions. But there's always something to learn from these ladies. Please give a big round of applause for Daniela.